What's going on, ladies and gents, boys and girls, guardians of all ages? Joker back again, once again. It's going to be a long and kinda depressing one, so let's just get into it. In July of 2021, Bungie spoke out against its former publisher, Activision Blizzard, after a lawsuit was filed by the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing back in July. There's a laundry list of accusations, but among them is sexual harassment, discrimination, workplace misconduct. Bungie would follow this announcement by releasing this statement. Bungie is built on empowering our people, no matter who they are, where they're from, or how they identify. We have a responsibility to acknowledge, reflect, and do what we can to push back on the persistent culture of harassment, abuse, and inequality that exists in our industry. It is our responsibility to ensure this type of behavior is not tolerated at Bungie at any level, and that we never excuse or sweep it under the rug. While the accounts in this week's news are difficult to read, we hope they will lead to justice, awareness, and accountability. We have a zero-tolerance policy at Bungie for environments that support this toxic culture, and we are committed to rooting them out and defending those who are at risk. Women, people of color, and underrepresented communities have nothing to gain by reliving their trauma. We believe them when they come forward with reports of abuse or harassment. We do not pretend that Bungie is perfect, and that no one has ever experienced harassment while working here. But we will not tolerate it, and we will confront it head on. And we will continue to do the work every day to be better. Our goal is to continue to improve the experience for everyone working at Bungie, and to do our part to make the gaming industry as a whole to be more welcoming and inclusive. Bungie then would go on to announce a bunch of changes that they were going to be implementing, like ending forced arbitration in the employee contract, a point that made big waves when announced because it was one of the demands that Activision Blizzard management were ignoring at the time. This got Bungie a bunch of clout, tons of articles written about them. Many perceive this as a called shot at Activision and being proactive about changes in the gaming industry that are desperately needed. Turns out Bungie had a few skeletons in their own closet. 26 employees, current and former, provided stories for an IGN article titled "The Battle for Bungie's Soul: Inside the Studio's Struggle for a Better Work Culture" by Rebecca Valentine. This article dealt with a 10-year period spanning from 2011 to 2021. In it, Valentine outlines a Bungie studio that is far different behind closed doors than they try to present themselves. A workplace full of sexism, harassment, racism, homophobia, a boys' club culture, crunch, HR in action, and actively protecting the abusers, systematic inequalities, rockstar leadership culture, and microaggressions. And while some of you may roll your eyes at that list or think, they just need to grow thicker skin, as I've seen people inevitably do on the internet, let me make a case for why this is bad, other than the self-evident, this is bad. If Bungie wants to pretend to be the moral arbiter of how everyone should be and act, well, they should probably make sure their own shit doesn't stink first. The article itself centers around the narrative team, a team I have been very, very critical, some would even say excessively so, over the last couple of years. Turns out, however, many on the writing staff had my same criticisms. For one example, the reason that Destiny has so many retcons is because no one had a vision for the future of Destiny. Some of Bungie's old guard were especially precious about the vision of Destiny 1, and reluctant to change anything about the tone, characterization, or direction of the story as the game moved into Destiny 2, and subsequent expansions. This was especially frustrating for the team in cases where that vision had never explicitly been defined in the game or elsewhere, but only existed as ideas in the heads of people who no longer worked in narrative. I mean, sit back for a moment and think about how not just bad this is for narrative storytelling, but how demoralizing for the worker this must be. You've just spent apparently upwards of 100 hours a week drafting a narrative. You take it to your boss, who looks at it and throws it all out because it doesn't fit the vision of what Destiny is. Then, when you ask your manager to clarify exactly what the vision of Destiny is, they don't have a clue, because no one has a fucking clue, but god damn it, they'll know it when they see it. And you know what? This may sound callous, but if that was the worst of it, we could scream "Joker's always right" from the hilltops, play "I am Nostradamus," and revel in the catharsis of being vindicated. Unfortunately, it's not. After Bungie's public decrying of Activision Blizzard and the reaffirmation of their in-studio standards. Many of Bungie Studios' current and former employees felt that their experiences at the company going as far back as 2011 and as recent as this year, 2021, when this article was written, dramatically clashed with Bungie's virtuous self-portrait. While some praised the news, for many others, hiring a D&I director or ending mandatory arbitration in all employee contracts was far too little, far too late. For others still, it was only one step in a long journey to a potentially better future, but with roadblocks remaining along the way. Now, I'm going to talk about this from a corporate PR perspective for a moment. Bungie condemning Activision and updating their policies wasn't a feat of altruism that just suddenly sprang to Pete Parsons' mind one night as he lay in bed reflecting on how he could make the world a better place. It was a calculated PR choice. Bungie worked closely with Activision Blizzard for years, creating, publishing, and supporting the Destiny franchise. Luke Smith, the former director of the Destiny franchise, who was just kind of silently shuffled off to go create a previously non-existent multimedia branch of Bungie, was an outspoken World of Warcraft fan. And much of Destiny was inspired by World of Warcraft. So even if Bungie's nose was clean, and they didn't have any skeletons in their proverbial closet, Bungie needed to separate themselves from Activision Blizzard and World of Warcraft even. It was just good PR. Better yet, it was the best kind of PR, free PR. However, as the saying goes, there's no such thing as a free meal. And we know they did have skeletons in their closet. And it seems that this move of sticking it to Activision and making changes within their studio did win them some good faith. Did Bungie management change their policies because they realized they were shit? No. However, regardless of intent, I'm glad these changes were made for the employees because, as we'll talk about as we go through the article proper, stress, overworked, miserable employees don't always bring their A game to the table. And so these changes, these better work environments for these employees, these better lifestyles for these employees, just make a better game. And with that said, before we get into this article proper, I know we're like 7 to 8 minutes in this video already, but I do want to ask something of my audience. Please do not use these people's suffering as a cudgel to harass Bungie employees or community managers or Destiny content creators. The reality is that many of these people probably didn't know what was happening. Some are the victims to what happened, and many are just innocent people that have their entire livelihood wrapped up in this company. They may have moved across the country to work at Bungie. They have families to support. The fault, as I've always stated, lies not in the employee at desk 357 who may have wrote a bad script. It lies at the feet of management. Hold Bungie accountable. Hold management accountable. Hold the CEO accountable. Do not harass them. Do not give them a victim narrative they can hide behind. With that out of the way, let's get into the story proper. There's no seemingly better microcosm for Bungie's historic company-wide cultural troubles than its narrative team, which has experienced toxic leadership, issues with crunch, and, at times, unmanageable separation between the ideas of old Bungie and new Bungie culture, and more, all within the last 5 or 6 years. This is something that we see time and time again with these sort of scandals. Old versus new management and tenured employees not changing with the times. And by that, I mean acting like an 800-plus person, multi-billion-dollar corporation is the same exact thing as 4 dudes making a game in their garage. And while nothing in this article indicates that Bungie was as bad as Activision Blizzard in this regard, with things like rampant alcoholism on the clock and the stealing of women's breast milk, what we are seeing across the industry are stories of old guard who built these companies and founded this industry in a lot of ways, being far too embedded in their old ways and forgetting that, sure, you're making games, and yeah, sure, it's a creative job, but it's still a job, and there's a level of professionalism that's just required. Which I guess is kind of ironic because I'll bet all the money in my pocket versus all the money in your pocket that you have a bunch of this old guard that never wanted to work a corporate job, so they started creating video games so they didn't have to work a corporate job, but now they are that corporate job they didn't want to work. And I'm going to be honest, in some of these instances, it really does come off as people who have no social skills, but probably have tenure or mechanical developing skills, who are being put in charge of others, not knowing how to deal with it, and breaking under the pressure and lashing out. We spoke to a number of individuals who were close to or a part of the narrative team, and painted a picture of a severely divided group whose problems originated back as far as Destiny 1. Several sources spoke of a narrative team lead from that time who appeared to suffer massive burnout during the project, creating an increasingly toxic work environment for others on the team. Enough so that the team members kept a countdown of days since his last explosion on a whiteboard. Many people I spoke to were familiar with the story of him throwing a chair at a window because he felt others were ruining his creative vision of the game. And yet, he stayed at the studio for several years, eventually leaving and then being invited back to do contract work on Destiny 2. Some sources who had encounters with him during his later periods said that he would frequently issue narrative direction despite no longer being a senior team member, and would become angry when he felt the Destiny 2 writers were deviating from his original vision for Destiny 1. One source told a story of him yelling at her over the phone so aggressively that she was brought to tears, and she subsequently refused to be on phone calls with him without a third party present. Now, there's absolutely no excuse for this. He was a professional. He was a leader in a work environment. Fucking act like it. With that said, look at what we know about Destiny 1 and Destiny 2's development. We know that these games were in development for years and years and years. One of the most prolific stories in the Destiny development nightmare saga is that of Joseph Staten, who worked on being the lead architect of the Destiny narrative universe, who worked to develop the game for years, and then in the 11th hour, an idiot by the name of Jason Jones comes in and says, well, the story is too linear and it doesn't jive with this idea I have of a directory. Yeah, no, how stupid does that sound? The directory is one of the reasons Destiny 1 was rebooted in the 11th hour, and then stitched together as some Frankenstein game. But the best fucking part in all of this is that management would basically ignore the entirety of Destiny 2's development for years, which led to another reboot. What's funny in retrospect about the Destiny 1 narrative reboot, the narrative we got was largely nonsensical, but from Taken King onward to today, the narrative is pretty fucking linear. Like, imagine working in this environment where management has basically ignored the development of Destiny for years on end, apparently, because they somehow didn't see that it was a bad game basically 5 minutes to midnight, and then 5 people come in one day and they want to see what you have. And they're like, that's okay, but it's not really what we're looking for. Could you start over? You know, months before release. And then they don't just make this mistake once. They do it twice that we know of. And I'm looking at Witch Queen's development and I'm thinking, I would not be surprised to read another Jason Schreier article about troubled Destiny development in the future. And I say this not to be mean, but you do have to wonder what exactly is going on over at Bungie. Destiny's story has always been interesting, but it's not particularly deep or complex. Sure, there's lore, but one of the most famous pieces of lore is nothing more than a Wild West retelling of Star Wars. Destiny isn't, for example, a game like Final Fantasy XIV, which is created by Destiny isn't a game like, say, Final Fantasy XIV, which is created by a much smaller team, with a more fleshed out narrative, mountains, and I mean mountains of dialogue, compared to the proverbial drop in the bucket that Destiny is in comparison. You have to wonder, what the hell is going on? Were people working hundreds of hours only to bring in reams of dialogue and lore and story ideas and have all of that just thrown out because fuck you, that's why? Is that really what was going on? Because what we get in the game and what's outlined in this article with stressful work conditions, 100-hour work weeks, does not seem to be reflected at all in the product that we receive. And that may sound cold and callous and mean, but no, my heart bleeds for these employees that had to suffer through this. Clearly, as the article outlines, this was mismanagement hell. The article would go on to highlight the working conditions. The narrative team worked 60, 70, 80, even 100-hour weeks during some expansions, frequently with no breaks in between crunch periods. Constantly having to ship new content, it saw high turnover and burnout as a result. So this is something that we've talked about many times on this channel, where Luke Smith would come out and he would say in his developer deep dives that the season pass model was basically untenable, that it was hard work, and that it stressed out a lot of people. And you'd be like, well, damn, maybe they shouldn't do the season pass model anymore if it's that bad. And I'm gonna be honest, the product that it's turning out isn't really that great. And then Luke Smith would be like, yeah, we're not just going to double down on it, we're going to quadruple down on it. In fact, it'll become the standard, regardless of developer health. And this is really where you would see the community's own selfishness come into play. Instead of realizing that 1 or 2 expansions a year would mean better, more creative content, because people who are burnt out, people who are stressed, people who are always grinding are not always going to bring their A game, but would come with the consumer cost of periods of content drought. The reply of fanboys would always boil down to essentially, do you want another 6 months of no content? We'd rather have bad content than no content. And then screech about the time between Taken King and Rise of Iron, without realizing the context of what actually happened between Taken King and Rise of Iron. You know, Destiny 2 being rebooted, low staffing, and worse, an over-reliance on contract work, which often pays less and has little to no benefits, just the hope that one day, maybe, you're going to be hired. These people would inevitably be cycled out. This is self-evidently horrible, because now you have this loop of writers constantly coming and going. How the actual fuck are you supposed to create any narrative consistency? I mean, no, really, think about it. You basically hire in some starry-eyed new employee who's excited to work at Bungie. Maybe they know about the Destiny world, maybe they don't, maybe they're just fresh out of college and didn't have a lot of time to play Destiny, but they played Halo and they're like, yeah, I'm gonna work on Destiny. That's cool, Bungie's my dream company. And they're brought in for contract work, and you basically have to get them up to speed on the story. Then in 3 to 6 months, you send them packing out the door and hire in a bunch of new people, which you also have to retrain. Adds to the crunch. But hey, the powers that be, the board of directors, the CEO, their bonus for using cheap labor is going to look good this year, and next year, and the year after. So what, you run through a couple of tenured employees. Great, you can just fire them, or they'll quit, and you can hire someone else, but cheaper. And it's shit like this, which is why the game is nowhere near as good as it could be. Or why instead of being a sustainable experience, it's one copy and paste horde mode after another copy and paste horde mode. Or why the story for years was so disjointed. You have this merry-go-round of workers coming and going because it's cheaper. And here's the reality. The only thing that matters to Bungie is how much does it cost to make X thing versus how cheap can they really make it for versus how much they can sell it for. They are, after all, a business. And I'm not begrudging Bungie for making that calculation. It's the exact same calculation every corporation on the face of the planet makes. But if you're wondering to yourself, oh, how could this happen? How could Bungie be such a meat grinder of a studio? Well, there you go. If they're making money hand over fist, and everybody's defending them, they have no reason to really change until it becomes a problem. And it's only really a problem when it affects their bottom line. What also didn't help is when the studio decided it was going to be a crunch-free studio, without all the prerequisite expanding of teams that would be required to see that vision. No, their solution was any feature that required crunch would simply be cut. This would be further compounded by other parts of the studio attacking the narrative team for the failures of DLCs like The Curse of Osiris. Now, this is hilarious to me because, yeah, I lambasted the story of Curse of Osiris. It was an absolute dumpster fire. But you know what else I lambasted? I don't know. Hot garbage such as the Infinite Forest. Not weapon crafting, or one of the biggest, most rewarding public events ever in Destiny history, which gave us 2 tokens and a blue. But you know who really fucked up Curse of Osiris? Whomever the jerk-off genius that thought double primaries and static roles was a good idea. Story can be overlooked, even if it's hot garbage. Bad gameplay cannot. So maybe, just maybe, these developers should probably not throw stones in glass houses, but I digress. The point being, these working conditions commanded so much that the narrative team started working off-the-clock crunch because they were terrified their part of the game would get further diminished or cut because cut features that cause crunch policy. Think about that for a moment. This was during Curse of Osiris, where there wasn't much narrative or lore. and people still had to crunch to get that story out? How many people are working on this? 2? And a lead? I get that writing is a long drawn out process, and writing on command is not easy, but this really does boil down to poor management, worse leadership, and absolutely no vision for where the franchise is going. The article continues with the only ex-Bungie employee willing to be named, and I'm probably going to butcher this name, Cookie Hapana. Throughout this article, I really came to like this ex-editor. Hired in 2016, she basically had a lot of the same issues with the Destiny narrative that I do, and confirmed a lot of things that I'd been saying over the years. Hapana recalled that when she first stepped in, Bungie hadn't had a lot of editing oversight on the Destiny franchise, and had not previously focused very much on its story, consistency, or continuity. That led to a leadership that appeared to operate without normal professional boundaries. As Hapana puts it, they just had a bunch of people who wrote things and kind of had the run of the place. First, to all the people who got mad at me or outright harassed me and sent me death threats over my assertion that the Destiny narrative wasn't as well thought out or planned as people believed, and that retcons really were retcons, and not some esoteric mystery shrouded in the ether that was just waiting to be uncovered. I'll take your apologies now, though I won't hold my breath. Second, this is still an issue within the Destiny lore where parts of the lore still contradict one another. And the reason for this is, up until probably last year, Bungie had no clue what the Destiny universe was, what the darkness was, what the light was. Very fundamental pillars of their universe were not explained. They were just making it up as they went along, because, well, this was especially frustrating for the team in cases where that vision had never explicitly been defined in the game or elsewhere, but only existed as ideas in the heads of people who no longer worked in narrative. I guess Joseph Staten really did get the last laugh in the end. And if only the totality of this article was just garden variety managerial incompetence and ego that led to some stress, some crunch, and sleepless nights, that would be one thing. It somehow, unfortunately, gets worse. One leader from earlier this period was described by one of our anonymous sources as a sexist nightmare, who yelled in meetings and would throw papers across tables. Multiple people told us he would frequently rewrite things at the last minute. Writers wouldn't learn about these changes to their work until after the voice lines had already been recorded. When people objected to his demeanor, he told them they needed thicker skins, and to learn how to take criticism. He called one woman on the team an unmanageable bitch. Another source said he was literally the worst person I'd ever worked for. Yeah, no wonder things in Destiny felt like the author couldn't be bothered to, I don't know, take the 5 minutes to Google search whether their work was consistent with the lore or not. Because they literally didn't. Given this circus of what could only be described as asshole management on top of the stressful working conditions we've already talked about, honestly, I'm surprised that the game we got with Destiny 1 and 2 wasn't in many regards worse. The article goes on and on and on like this. From small things like the team that developed the cinematics doing everything in their power to be separate from the rest of the writing team, which would often lead to a disconnect between the cinematics and the narrative and the lore, to people getting put on teams whose projects inevitably fail because they don't have the support or the funding. Which, if I might digress for a moment, sounds a lot like the PvP team. We kept hearing about how there's going to be a refocus on PvP, only to have Trials of Osiris released half-baked, and take, a year and a half, if not longer, to fix, no new maps in nearly 2 years, and a sandbox lead who doesn't understand the sandbox. Which once again begs a question, and I really want to hammer this home. With 800 employees, where exactly are all of these people? The more I read this article, the more it seems like the writers were understaffed. The PvP team is non-existent. People are routinely placed in dead-end projects that are understaffed, underfunded, that go nowhere. And these dead-end projects, mind you, are actively used against employees during their employee reviews. It really does sound like Destiny wasn't Bungie's focus for the last few years. Something that's only recently changed, and Bungie was more concerned with projects like Matter. The article would go on to describe a situation in 2019 where everything became untenable. The entire writing staff tried a last-ditch effort to mediate their constant conflicts with their leads with HR, but were once again told they needed to try harder to try to work with the people who are making their lives miserable daily, despite the team reiterating that the leads did not appear to be making efforts to build these same bridges on their end. Many wrote letters to the CEO, Pete Parsons, begging for help. They never heard back. That right there makes Pete Parsons' entire apology, if you can call it that, nothing more than marketing. He didn't give a fuck until it threatened to affect his bottom line. In this context, Bungie's admonishment of Activision wasn't some righteous moral outrage. It was covering their own ass. It was protecting themselves if and when this ever got outed. Bungie has all these core values that it claims to stand for, because that's good marketing, it's good PR. Like I said, Pete Parsons didn't wake up one day and realize that things needed to change. He was forced to change them, to have something to point to when the good image of his company was shattered. And while this is inevitably good for the employees, the motives behind those actions matter. It wasn't to create a better work environment. They knew how bad it was. For the better part of a decade, it was to save their own asses. But hey, those are just my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Remember to like, but only if you did, subscribe for more. Feel free to donate to my Patreon if you're feeling particularly generous, but above all else, stay frosty.